Hey everyone, my name is Vojchehoske and welcome to the Real Estate Classroom YouTube channel. Hey, like always, do me a favor, give this video a thumbs up, hit that red subscribe button, click on the notification bell, and comment some questions down below in the comment section. So in today's video, we're going to discuss environmental laws. 4 major federal laws that you have to know because you're going to have to know them for your real estate licensing exam. So let's get to today's video. So in today's video, we're going to focus in on 4 specific federal laws that you as someone studying for your real estate licensing exam simply have to know. And some of this you're also going to have to know for the practice or practitioner side of real estate as well. Now, again, today's video is on those 4 specific laws. Now, in my very next video, I'm going to talk about other specific real estate environmental issues that you have to know as a practitioner and for the real estate licensing exam as well, but not so much the laws involved with them. Things like asbestos. You have to know certain things about asbestos, but not really the specific laws behind the governance of asbestos. So that'll be in my next video. But in this video, there are 4 specific federal laws that we need to discuss. They are the Flood Control Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. Now, there's those only 4, and they're federal. You have to understand that on your state exam, you may be asked questions about state-specific or local-specific environmental laws. Very common for states to mirror the federal statute and then add further restrictions. All right, so that's very common. So you have to know them for your state side of the exam. This is covering the national portion that you're going to need for the national portion of the real estate exam. All right, so now the first one is the Flood Control Act. And actually, this is where flood insurance comes from, to be quite honest with you. For those of you, obviously, that you're not in the real estate business, so you don't understand or may not know the importance of flood insurance, it comes as a result of this law being passed. Now, the Flood Control Act does a couple of things. First of all, it created the Federal Insurance Agency, and that agency is tasked with going out to the private sector in partnership to provide flood insurance. So there's a little backstory to this that you have to know. So as the urban sprawl happened and as the population density grew, we needed more and more. We need more and more space to live in. And so it started creeping into areas that were typically considered floodplains. That means a floodplain, or if a property is located in a floodplain, that means there's a higher than average chance that it's going to flood at some point. We have like 100-year floodplains and 500-year floodplains, etc. And the private sector insurance industry simply could not do flood insurance because it's such a total loss when it floods, it would have bankrupted the entire system. So the insurance industry just said, we're not going to do it. So the federal government, under the Flood Control Act, they went in and they partnered with the private sector to create a program called flood insurance. And it's a type of subsidy, and it's reauthorized every year, and it allows people that live in a floodplain to get flood insurance. Now, it's a little expensive, and it's in addition to your normal homeowner's insurance. However, it does provide a mechanism for flood insurance to protect your assets. It does a couple other things, though. The Flood Control Act also puts restrictions, certain restrictions on future developments in those floodplains. And then it also requires communities, local communities, to have plans to reduce losses from flooding. Things like having a dam system on creeks and brooks and those type of things, and small rivers that have a tendency to flood, in spillways and things like that. So it required local communities to have flood reducing practices put in place. That's the Flood Control Act. The second one is the Clean Water Act. Again, this is a federal regulation. This is actually administered by the Environmental Protection Agency, or commonly known as the EPA. There's a lot of things that this law does, but what you have to know is it regulates the discharges into navigable waterways. Now, that's a little misleading because the navigable waterway would be considered like the Missouri River or the Mississippi River, where there's commercial commerce on those waterways. But it also extends to the tributaries. So you may have a really small stream that runs through your state or area, but because it is a tributary of the Missouri River or the Mississippi River, it is also protected and covered under the Clean Water Act. All right, it protects and regulates how wetlands and underground water sources may be used and what can be discharged into those areas. It was real common a few years back in the Midwest, in the farm areas, where the EPA was doing flyovers with planes to look for, irrigation systems that would water the crops over the aquifers, like in Nebraska and Wyoming. And if they would see if the farmer would, when they did oil changes on those automated irrigation systems, if they would capture the oil properly, or would they just let the oil just spill out onto the ground, which would seep down into that underground water source. So again, those are the things that the Clean Water Act, they do. They protect those sources, and it also regulates what kind of things may be discharged into those water sources. And quite frankly, the licensee must be aware of these laws that govern local wetlands so they can advise clients properly. So let me give you an example. If you work in the agriculture arena, you would have a duty to know that it's not okay to just simply on your irrigation systems, when you're changing the oil, to simply let it, you drain the oil onto the ground, those type of things. So you have to have some knowledge so you could properly consult your clients. The Safe Drinking Water Act, the biggest thing about this particular law that you have to know is it established safe drinking water standards. It provided a baseline for local utilities, public utilities and private utilities, that provides drinking water to the public, and also set standards for testing well water, because not everybody has access to public water sources. So it provided a standard baseline for what is considered safe. And it does require, at a minimum, that public utilities and private utilities or private providers of drinking water meet those minimum standards. It also, as I said, it provided a baseline. So when you have your well tested, which is common in rural areas, where if you live on a ranch, you're not going to have access to public water sources, so you have to dig a well. It set a standard so when you test that well, you could find out whether or not that water underground is going to be usable for drinking water or not. All right, so it also in part helps protect the groundwater from contamination, and also from septic tanks and underground storage tanks. There was another provision that also in the Safe Drinking Water Act provided those protections from, like septic tanks have to have certain standards, and underground storage tanks have to have certain standards so they don't contaminate those groundwater sources. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. We're going to be very basic here. When you get into the real estate world and you go to your first brokerage, they're really going to train you on what you need to know from a practitioner point of view. But understand that the reason we have the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act is lead-based products were used in houses basically built prior to 1978. Now, not including 1978, but 1977 and older, prior to 1978. And the further back that you go, quite honestly, the more propensity there is to find lead-based paint hazards within that house. And understand that exposure to lead can be very deadly and very damaging to not only adults, but in particular children. And the exposure targets brain and nervous activities, the nervous system. So it can give you brain damage, or it can damage your nervous system. And it's very dangerous for children in particular. It can be very harmful to adults as well, but children is the one that it really targets the most. So in 1992, the federal government passed a law called the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. And it had a certain requirements for sellers and landlords and real estate professionals. And here's what you need to know for your test. Number one, this law was passed in 1992, and it requires the seller or the seller's authorized representative, such as their real estate agent or their property manager, to disclose any known lead hazards in a property that's for sale or that is for lease. All right, and this applies to any home built prior to 1978. Remember, not including 1978, but built prior to. And one thing I also want to talk about here is this applies to residentially zoned properties. All right, but here's the kicker. If a property is being used as a residential dwelling illegally, then it still applies. So let me give you an example. Maybe there's a garage and it's zoned commercial. But on the second level of the garage, there is like a little living area, and the owner of that garage decides to rent it out as an apartment. Well, even though it's being rented out illegally because it's contrary to what the zoning will allow, nonetheless, it's being used as a residential dwelling. So therefore, even though it's being rented out illegally, the lead-based paint hazard reduction processes would be required. All right, the other thing that it requires is the seller or the lessor, and remember the lessor is the landlord or the property manager, they must provide the buyer or the tenant a written disclosure of whether or not there's any known lead-based paint hazards and or any documents or reports about that, whether those reports show lead-based paint or they show negative results. Either way, they have to be provided. This is key here. On your screen, I have it bold or in capital letters, prior to the tenant or the buyer entering into a contract. So that lead-based paint disclosure, that written disclosure from the seller or the seller's authorized representative, including any documentation that may be available, must be given to that buyer prior to the buyer signing the lease or the purchase contract or the tenant signing the lease agreement. That is required under this particular law. The seller must also provide the purchaser a 10-day opportunity to have a lead assessment done. A lead assessment is basically lead testing. It is a cost that the buyer will have to pay. That is not a seller cost. And even if an assessment is done, there is no requirement for the seller to abate. It's for informational purposes only. Two things you have to know about this, though. Number one is that 10-day opportunity can be negotiated. So the buyer and the seller could negotiate a 7-day or a 14-day period. That part can be negotiated. If they cannot come to terms, then it defaults back to the 10-day. The other thing is the seller cannot say no to the assessment. If the purchaser wants to have the assessment done, the seller cannot use that as a term to reject the purchase contract. There are hefty fines should that occur. Now, this same opportunity does not extend to tenants who are leasing out one of these dwellings built prior to 1978. That is only exclusive to purchasers. All right, the other thing that buyers and tenants must be given, the next bullet point there, it's called a booklet, and it's called Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. That is a booklet that basically describes and outlines things that buyers and tenants can do to protect them and their family in the home, lead safe practices, those type of things. But that must be given along with that disclosure and any reports that the seller or the seller's authorized representative may have prior to any contract being signed. And then the last thing is the licensee must ensure compliance with these requirements. So the buyer and the seller, or the property management or a manager or the tenant's agent, they have certain duties that they have to know and do under this particular law. So on the listing side, the listing agent, they must ensure that the seller knows that they have to truthfully complete this lead-based paint disclosure, and they have to provide the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, all of those things. It is the listing agent's responsibility that the buyer or that the seller part of this process is adhered to, and then the buyer's agent or the tenant's agent, they also have an duty and obligation to do their side of it to make sure that their client, their buyer or their tenant gets all the proper documentation and disclosures and whatnot. So all the licensees or agents in this real estate deal have duties and responsibilities as well. Now, the last thing I'd just point out here is down in the description of this video, there are links to 2 videos that I've already done. One is how to properly complete the lead-based paint disclosure from the buyer-seller perspective and the landlord-tenant. So one video is landlord-tenant, one is buyer-seller, because the forms are different and you have to use the right form for the right transaction. All right, that's all I have for this video. If you're going to continue studying, check out this video right here. That is the one where we talk about the environmental issues such as asbestos and those type of things. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the little circle to the left. I'd appreciate it. That's all I got. I'll see you all in the next video.